Most people learn the definition of an asset and a liability sometime in school, and then they never really revisit the topic. An asset is something you own, whereas a liability is something that you owe. And for a lot of people, that's where the thinking stops. But that framework, as simple as it is, breaks down pretty quickly when you start applying it to real life decisions. Because the question of whether something's actually working for you or against you is a lot more nuanced than just what shows up on a balance sheet. And in 2026, with the economic environment we're sitting in, I think it's worth slowing down and thinking through this more carefully than most people do. Here's what I want to cover. I want to start with the traditional definition and where it falls short, because I think the standard framing misleads a lot of people into thinking they're building wealth when they're really not. Then I want to talk about how the current environment, interest rates, inflation, and the way AI is starting to reshape industries changes what actually qualifies as an asset worth holding. And I'll close with how I think about this practically, both in my personal finances and in running a business, because the same principles apply in both places, even when the specifics look different. So let me start with the definition problem. The classic definition of an asset is anything with positive value that you own. So you think your house, your car, your business equipment, and technically that's right, but the more useful question, the one that actually determines whether your financial position is improving, is whether the things you own are generating value or consuming it. Robert Kiyosaki made this point famous in Rich Dad Poor Dad. And even if you've heard it before, it's worth sitting with it in current context. A primary residence is listed as an asset on your personal balance sheet. It may appreciate over time, but while you're living in it, it's generating no income and it's consuming significant cash. Mortgage payments, property taxes, and insurance. That is not behavior of an asset that's working for you. It's the behavior of a very expensive liability with potential upside. That doesn't mean you shouldn't own a home. It means you should understand what it actually is and not count it as wealth building in your mental accounting until it's doing something more than simply sitting there. This same logic applies to business. Equipment that you own is an asset, but equipment that sits idle, depreciates faster than it earns, or ties up capital that could be deployed elsewhere, it's functioning more like a liability, regardless of what your accounting balance sheet says. The distinction I've come to think matters most is not owned versus owed, it's productive versus consumptive. Does this thing generate cash? Does it appreciate in value or give me meaningful leverage? Or does it require cash, depreciate, and create obligations? That mental reframe really changes how you evaluate almost every financial decision. So now let me talk about why 2026 specifically changes this entire conversation. The interest rate environment of the last few years has fundamentally altered the math on a lot of things that used to be straightforward. When money was essentially free, when you could borrow at 2 or 3%, debt as a tool for acquiring assets made obvious sense. The cost of the debt was so low that almost any reasonable asset could outperform it. That's not the environment that we're in today, so you have to change your thinking. When you're borrowing at 6, 7, 8% or higher, the bar for what an asset needs to return to justify the leverage is significantly higher. A lot of people build their financial strategy in a low rate world, and they haven't recalibrated for the one we're currently living in. If you're carrying debt at rates that your assets cannot consistently outperform, you're not building a productive portfolio, you're slowly being consumed by the cost of carrying it. Inflation is the second piece, and it interacts with the rate environment in a way that's worth understanding. Inflation erodes your purchasing power, which is why people say cash is a liability in an inflationary environment. It's losing real value every year it sits still. That's true, but it creates a temptation to move it into assets just for the sake of moving the cash out, without being selective about what those assets actually are. Not everything that beats cash beats inflation meaningfully, and not everything that protects against inflation is something you should be holding. Real assets, productive real estate, businesses with pricing power, and commodities in certain contexts have historically been reasonable inflation hedges. But selection still matters, and buying something because it's not cash is not the same as buying something that will actually grow your position. The third thing that's specific to right now is the way AI is starting to reshape which skills, businesses, and roles retain long-term value. I want to be careful here because I think there's a lot of noise in this conversation, and a lot of people make sweeping claims that just aren't fully thought through. But what I do think there's a real version of this that applies to the asset versus liability framework in a way that isn't fully discussed. If you think about your career, your professional skills, and your business model as assets, which they are in the most meaningful sense, then the question of whether you're appreciating or depreciating is a real question. A skill set that was scarce and valuable 5 years ago may be significantly more commoditized today because of what AI can do. A business model that relied on information asymmetry or repetitive knowledge work may be under more pressure than it looks. I'm not saying this to create anxiety. I'm saying it because the same discipline that you apply to your financial assets, is this appreciating or depreciating? Is it generating or consuming? Applies to how you invest in yourself and your business. And the honest answer to that question looks different in 2026 than it did even a few years ago. So you might be asking, how do I actually think about this in practice? On the personal side, I'm looking for assets that generate income or appreciate in ways that aren't purely speculative. Productive real estate, property that cash flows after debt service, is the clearest example in my world. A business that generates consistent earnings is another. I'm skeptical of those assets where the value is primarily driven by sentiment or a narrative rather than the underlying economics. That doesn't mean that I avoid them entirely and throw them out the window, but I wouldn't anchor my financial security to them. And I'm honest with myself about what's actually an asset versus what I'm calling an asset because it makes me feel better about owning it. On the business side, the same discipline applies. The assets I want in Exeter are the ones that compound. So reputation, relationships, systems, good people. Those are harder to put on a balance sheet, but they're the things that actually determine whether the business is going to be worth more next year than it is this year. Equipment, inventory, physical capital, yes, those are tools, not engines. I want to be clear about the difference. The liability side of this is equally important to think about actively. Not all liabilities are bad. Debt used to acquire a productive asset that consistently outperforms the cost of that debt is a reasonable tool. The problem is liabilities that exist to fund consumption, that carry rates the underlying asset can't beat, or that create ongoing obligations without creating ongoing value. Consumer debt at high rates is the obvious version, but there are business liabilities that operate the exact same way. Overhead structures that don't scale with revenue, commitments made in a different interest rate environment that just don't make sense in this one, capacity that costs money every month regardless of whether there's work to fill it. The question that I come back to is a very simple one. Is this making me stronger or more constrained? That applies to a loan, a piece of equipment, a skill set, a client relationship, or even a hire. The balance sheet captures your moment in time. What actually matters is the direction of that travel. Are the things that I own and the obligations I carry moving me toward a more productive, more resilient position? Or are they quietly working against me while I'm focused on other things? And that's the real work of financial discipline, and it doesn't require a complicated system. It requires honesty and the willingness to ask the question regularly and ask it objectively, not just when something is clearly wrong. If this was useful, a like and a subscribe helps this content find more people who are thinking about this stuff seriously. And if there's a specific aspect of this you want me to go deeper on, drop it in the comments.